Additional considerations. Cultural ideologies revisited. As just discussed, changes set in beginning around 1970 that heightened pederasty's deviant status, rendering it considerably more derogated than previously, while virtually eliminating the deviant status for androphile gay sexuality, which quickly became not simply tolerated, but acceptable in many circles. For example, across states in the United States, pederastic behaviors that might have brought probation or minimal prison sentences half a century ago today are routinely subject to decades or life in prison, Hubbard in this volume, whereas gay relations that subjected the participants to prison half a century ago are now increasingly becoming eligible for marriage. The discussion of cultural ideologies and social structures up to this point needs supplementing to adequately account for the intensity of this altered cultural thinking with respect to pederasty. An older cultural ideology that informed an important foundation for the changes after 1970 was childhood innocence, the conviction that children are asexual and need to avoid sex for healthy development. This notion emerged during the Enlightenment and formed the basis for the masturbation hysteria from the mid-18th century to early 20th centuries, in which childhood masturbation was claimed to cause a long list of maladies from acne to death. Hare, 1962. It also influenced Freud's early theory that childhood seduction is the cause of all neuroses. Foucault, 1978. As Foucault showed, these beliefs developed in response to changing social conditions and relations between the state and individuals, in which it was useful for the state to asexualize children, and in which clinicians accommodated the state in their theorizing. That childhood innocence is a Western belief, not a scientific fact, was empirically demonstrated by Ford and Beach, 1951, in their cross-cultural and cross-species review of child sexual development. Another older cultural ideology was that sex was for procreation. By the 1970s, in consequence of the sexual revolution, this older ethos was replaced by consenting adults as the legitimate basis for sexual relations, Levine and Troyden, 1988, which helped enable gay liberation to occur and succeed. At the same time, various feminists were raising consciousness about rape of women, making quick gains in changing social views and response. Following this success, they moved on to incest, attributing to it the same motives, e.g. power, and effects, e.g. trauma, lasting maladjustment, which they observed in or attributed to rape. Sexual victimology, consisting of a loose network of mental health and law enforcement professionals concerned with sexual victimization, arose in response to the campaigns against rape and incest. It appeared as a scientific discipline on the surface, but adopted as axiomatic the assumptions, theorizing, and ideologies espoused by the anti-rape and anti-incest feminist advocates. By the early 1980s, the rape and incest models became the basis for sexual victimological understanding of all forms of adult minor sex. Jenkins, 1998, 2006. From a scientific point of view, what is problematic is that many feminist advocates in the 1970s focusing on sexual abuse were given to hyperbole in service of political aims. Angelides, 2004-2005, Sommers, 1995. Their goal was to uproot the patriarchy, in which challenging or undermining ideologies of masculinity was instrumental. Using male sexual transgressions of all types became a chief tactic, and freely mixing hyperbolized claims with valid ones became routine. Jenkins, 1998 and 2006. Angelides, 2004, referred to these advocates as, quote, radical feminists, whereas Sommers, 1995, referred to them as gender feminists. Such activists did not represent all types of feminists in the 1970s or afterward, e.g. prominent feminist writers such as Camille Paglia or Gail Rubin opposed their ideology, message, and tactics. Importantly, however, their point of view came to dominate throughout the West. Sexual victimology emerged, incorporated their point of view, and gave it a, quote, scientific face. In other words, hyperbole and ideology were built into the foundations of sexual victimology. Though it has never been a valid science, its assertions have been taken as scientific and have substantially influenced public policy. Malone, 2011. In terms of adult minor sex, the hyperbole of these activists and sexual victimologists was readily accepted by professionals and the public, in part because it was built on top of the already existing ideology of childhood innocence. Freud's seduction theory was revived by sexual victimologists, and adult minor sex came to be invested with all the pathogenic agency that had once been attributed to masturbation. Jenkins, 1998, Malone, 2010. In the 1980s, the results of this 1970s thinking were dramatic as moral panic spread across the United States, with satanic sexual ritual abuse by staff in daycare and recovered memories by adult patients in therapy. Jenkins, 1998, Nathan and Snedeker, 1995. These false claims, repeatedly sensationalized in uncritical media coverage, firmly implanted in social thinking the belief that adult minor sex is the ultimate crime with the most extreme negative psychological effects. In short, building upon earlier assumptions about childhood innocence, reflecting the new ideology of anything goes provided it involves consenting adults, and proceeding from radical feminist discourse, all adult minor sex became equated with rape and incest, accompanied by assumptions of invariable imposition of power, lack of consent, and extreme harm. Jenkins, 1998, Malone, 2011. Pederasty, being a type of adult minor sex, came to be fully invested with this ideology. In 1980, the National Organization for Women issued an opinion, clarifying its view on pederasty to remove any previously existing ambiguity. It resolved that pederasty is, quote, an issue of exploitation or violence, not affectional or sexual preference or orientation, unquote, quoted in Jenkins, 2006, page 125. Such thinking has since been an entrenched social belief. An early paradigmatic illustration of this thinking was a 1984 editorial in a major U.S. newspaper in which the writers decried a series of recently uncovered sexual relations between men aged 18 and over and boys aged 12 to 17. That is to say, pederastic relations, Philadelphia Inquirer, 1984, 22a. The writers asserted that, quote, there can be no question, unquote, that such relations, quote, are among the most brutalizing crimes known to civilized society, unquote. They claimed that all credible psychological and psychiatric theory and recognized that all relations of this sort are profoundly damaging and quote, leave emotional scars, distrust, and self-contempt that last through lifetimes, unquote. They further claimed that this theorizing rested on, quote, the truth that such contacts invariably involve the imposition of power and exploitation in the most fearfully private of ways, unquote. They emphasized that these relations had nothing to do with homosexuality and that homosexuals who deserve dignity should not be confused with, quote, pathological and criminal pedophiles, unquote. What is notable in this diatribe is its point-by-point adherence to radical feminist discourse, even while presuming to be scientific. In 1984, the large bulk of scientific literature on pederasty actually reported it to be benign or beneficial. See Empirical review earlier in this article. But the editorial, driven by ideological fervor, committed the moralistic fallacy by strongly reading into the pederastic relations many of the talking points of this ideology. From this time frame to now, there has been an unbroken chain in mainstream media coverage in which the view, tone, and hyperbole in this editorial have been repeated. Notably, the editorial writers, journalistic forebearers a generation earlier, under a different set of cultural ideologies, were given to similar tirades against gay men, rather than advocating dignity for them. In sum, cultural ideologies and social structures have strongly influenced both the practice and perception of pederasty across time and place. These influences in the modern West over the last 4 decades have been especially potent in this regard. It is important in scientific analysis to take such influences under consideration. By contrast, relying on current cultural ideologies and the social structure as final reference points in making claims about factual matters, e.g., pederasty is, quote, profoundly damaging, is to invite commission of the moralistic fallacy.